In the 1950s, in order to combat the perceived inequalities and injustices of British-controlled Kenya, a revolt against colonial rule took place known as the Mau Mau uprising. This resulted in a fierce crackdown on the rebels by the British administration that, while successfully crushing the opposition, sowed the seeds of what would ultimately become Kenya's independence in 1963. The British colonial presence in Kenya began in the late 19th century as part of what was known as the Scramble for Africa, where European colonial nations attempted to ensure control of this vital continent through the widespread seizure of territory. The region today known as Kenya had previously been under the control of the Sultan of Zanzibar, but pressure from Britain and its military had forced the Sultan to hand over the territory to the British Empire alongside the neighbouring Tanganyika to Germany. This agreement was negotiated in the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, with the British gaining control over most of the East African coast. From around 1890, the British began to move inland, hoping to gain access to the fertile highlands and provide greater security for Uganda, which had also been claimed as a British colony. The Mombasa and Kisumu railway line was built using Indian workers in order to facilitate this expansion, while British forces were sent to suppress any resistance from the ethnic groups living in the Central Highlands, predominantly the Maasai, the Kikuyu, and the Kamba. The response from the native African populace initially ranged between hostility and welcome, although following the use of intimidation by the colonial troops to ensure these tribes fell into line, all hospitality was withdrawn and active resistance emerged. While the Maasai generally avoided military confrontation with the British, the Kikuyu attempted to mount some resistance to the intrusion of imperial forces into their land, leading to colonial troops hunting down the Kikuyu and Kamba people as part of punitive expeditions. Much of this action against the native tribes was politically motivated, with collaborative tribes, who were willing to work alongside the British, being elevated to positions of power. One result of this was a widespread famine, which followed from the combined effects of pacification of the natives and an epidemic of rinderpest among the livestock that led to a significant loss of life and property among the indigenous people. From 1903, European settlers began to establish their own homesteads within Kenya, claiming disproportionately large amounts of land for the grazing of cattle that was seized directly from the natives. This was aided by a policy of reallocation being adopted that expropriated fertile land from locals in order to give it to the white farmers, who mostly moved from Britain or South Africa. Amid this pattern of native Kenyans being forced off their traditional tribal lands, this action was made legal under British law with the Crown Lands Ordinance Act of 1915, which removed the few remaining land rights of the native people and turned them into an agricultural proletariat. Matters only worsened following the end of World War I, when the British government undertook a scheme to settle many ex-soldiers in the region, thus exacerbating the trend for land seizures. In response, the native tribes opted to form organizations that campaigned for greater land rights for the indigenous inhabitants, including the East African Association, or EAA, of 1921, and later the Kenyan African Union, or KAU, in 1942, after the EAA had been banned 20 years prior. Following the end of World War II in 1945, the discontent among the native Kenyans was intensified by a lack of progress when it came to ensuring the rights of dispossessed tribal people. The majority of the indigenous population lived in impoverished Nairobi slums with little chance of employment or basic social justice, while by comparison the European settlers, together with Indian immigrants, were able to enjoy comparative luxury in colonial Kenya. Out in the countryside, the Kikuyu tribe had been driven into reserves, while their original lands were carved up among 3,000 European families, leading to an overwhelming sense of discontentment among both the city-dwelling and rural native populations that rapidly spilled over into open hostility during the early 1950s. As the KAU attempted to seek constitutional routes to legal reforms that favoured the natives, more radical elements demanded immediate action, and thus led to a number of small-scale attacks and sabotage on European property throughout the Kenyan highlands that garnered huge support, using a campaign of oath-taking to commit others to the anti-colonial cause. The movement that emerged became known as the Mau Mau, and with their ability to disrupt colonial operations being more apparent than the political KAU, the latter soon adopted a more radical position. Unfortunately for them, the British government did not take the matter seriously, and did little to satisfy the grievances of the newly formed group of radicals, thus inevitably leading to increased levels of violence by the Mau Mau, initially targeting Kikuyu who collaborated with the Europeans. 1952 saw a wave of violence directed at police witnesses who provided testimony against Africans, particularly in cases related to the Mau Mau, while prominent collaborators were assassinated and a small number of white settlers were also attacked. The police responded by initiating a mass campaign of arrests, detaining Kikuyu suspected of Mau Mau involvement and taking others into preventative detention so as to neutralize the support base of the Mau Mau. This indiscriminate repression served only to increase the support of the Mau Mau among indigenous Kenyans, and by the summer of 1952, around 90% of Kikuyu adults had taken the Mau Mau oath. Kikuyu chiefs were encouraged by the government to speak out against the Mau Mau and administer cleansing oaths, which would supposedly absolve Kenyans from the oath taken to support the anti-colonial cause. At the same time, KAU officials, including Jomo Kenyatta, also publicly spoke out against the actions of the movement, although due to the threat of assassination by the Mau Mau, many stopped short of outright condemnation. In October 1952, Senior Chief Waruhi, a prominent collaborator and the harshest critic of the Mau Mau among the Kikuyu chiefs, was assassinated near Nairobi, leading to celebration within its ranks and concern among the colonial government. Finally, the administration realized that the Mau Mau posed a serious threat to British rule in Kenya, and the decision was taken to actively challenge and engage the rebels, leading to a state of emergency being declared 2 weeks later, and the enactment of Operation Jock Scott as a coordination of police operations. 187 Kikuyu, who were considered by the government to be the leaders of the Mau Mau movement, were arrested, although this largely resulted in the detention of KAU members, while high-ranking leaders of the Mau Mau Central Committee remained elusive in the Kenyan highlands. To support the police, British troops were deployed into rural areas so as to disrupt rebel operations and present an intimidation factor that would force the Mau Mau to lay down their arms. The rebels responded by assassinating another senior Kikuyu chief and several European settlers, while thousands of Mau Mau left their homes and set up camp in the forests of the Aberdares and Mount Kenya, creating a base of resistance to the government. These fighters soon beginning to organize, and several military commanders emerged, including Wahuri Itote and Dedan Kimathi. For the rest of 1952, however, hostilities remained generally subdued, but by the following year started with a series of violent killings of European farmers and loyalist Africans, a move that shocked the colonial population into demanding more direct action against the Mau Mau. Therefore, the Kenyan security forces were placed under the command of the British Army and began to surround the Mau Mau strongholds in the forests. This was accompanied by a large-scale eviction of Kikuyu squatters from land that had been selected for European settlers, the government troops adopting a policy of collective punishment intended to undermine popular support for the Mau Mau. Under this policy, if a member of a village was found to be a Mau Mau supporter, then the entire village was treated as such, thus leading to the eviction of many Kikuyu who were forced to abandon their homes and possessions and sent to areas designated as Kikuyu reserves. In addition, concentration camps were established in order to detain, without trial and due process, those suspected of Mau Mau involvement, thus serving to only increase the anger and fear among the Kikuyu, which resulted in more fighters joining the ranks of the Mau Mau and a further escalation of violence on March 26, 1953, when Mau Mau fighters carried out two major attacks. The first was an assault on the Naivasha police station, which resulted in a humiliating defeat for the police and the release of 173 prisoners from an adjacent detention camp, while the second was the massacre of Kikuyu loyalists at Lari, in which at least 97 Kenyans were killed. This incident was used by the government to further characterize the Mau Mau as brutal savages, these attacks beginning a pattern of Mau Mau raids against the police and loyalists that continued throughout 1953. Meanwhile, the gradual organization of the rebel forces in the forest continued, creating military units, although these were limited by a lack of weapons, supplies, and training. Initially, the battle against the Mau Mau was conducted in the tropical forests of the Kenyan highlands by British regular army troops with little experience in this particular environment, and thus their efforts were largely ineffective, and the Mau Mau rebels could easily evade or ambush British patrols with minimal losses to their own faction. This policy soon changed when units from the Kenyan army replaced British troops in the forests, while the British army patrolled the perimeter of the woodlands, cutting off any means of escape for Mau Mau rebels should they attempt to evade the more experienced Kenyan soldiers. The Royal Air Force also provided advanced reconnaissance and conducted air raids on Mau Mau camps that sent the rebels scattering into the forest, where they were easily picked off by the Kenyan army. While the RAF raids had limited success due to the thick foliage, continuous bombing of the forest did serve to demoralize the Mau Mau fighters, and with their hiding places being rapidly mopped up, large-scale confrontations between the under-equipped rebels and frontline Kenyan and British troops was inevitable. When these occurred, they resulted in decidedly one-sided battles that saw hundreds of rebels killed against minor colonial losses, and by the end of 1953, over 3,000 Mau Mau had been confirmed as killed and 1,000 captured, including Mau Mau leader Wahui Itote. Inside the British concentration camps, almost 100,000 suspected Mau Mau awaited processing without trial, although in spite of this, the rebel faction continued to pose an effective resistance to the colonial regime. Even so, the campaign of attacks on settlers and collaborators continued, particularly in Nairobi, where the Mau Mau had a sizable, if largely clandestine, support base. In order to ensure a quick and clean suppression of the Mau Mau, Operation Anvil was enacted during 1954 with the aim of crushing the rebel presence in Nairobi, police moving from street to street, detaining anyone they considered suspicious, resulting in tens of thousands of male Kikuyu being arrested and taken to concentration camps. Meanwhile, the colonial administration began a policy of villagization, wherein rural Kikuyu were forced to relocate from their traditional scattered homes to newly built villages under the control of the British. By the end of 1954, 1 million Kikuyu had been driven from their family homes and rehoused in these villages, which were little more than fenced camps which were prone to famine and disease. From the British viewpoint, in spite of the humanitarian cost, this brutal action was seen to effectively sever all material and logistical support for the Mau Mau based in the Kenyan highlands. In early 1955, with the Mau Mau now confined to the forest, British troops swept in to mop up the remaining resistance, who by now were suffering from a lack of food and ammunition. This had only limited success, with the rebels being able to evade the British patrols, but for the Mau Mau there was no longer any possibility of undertaking a concerted military effort against the colonial forces, and by the end of the year only 1,500 fighters remained in the woods. The following year, in October 1956, Kimathi, the most important of the remaining Mau Mau commanders, was captured and put on trial, his arrest being seen as a symbolic end of the Mau Mau uprising, as morale among the survivors crumbled. Eventually, the few fighters still at large in the forest disbanded, a lack of rebel activity soon seeing British troops leaving Kenya, although the state of emergency remained in place until 1960. In the end, 11,503 Mau Mau were killed as a result of the anti-insurgency campaign undertaken by the British, thereby making it among the most successful punitive actions by the colonial power in the years following World War II. By comparison, 3,000 Kenyan and British soldiers were killed alongside a large number of civilians, either assassinated by the Mau Mau or killed by the colonists on suspicion of being rebel sympathizers, the overall death toll for the uprising being approximately 25,000 people killed, regardless of faction. The Mau Mau rebellion also gave rise to a variety of war crimes perpetrated by both sides, with the British and Kenyan authorities being responsible for the torture and sexual abuse of suspected Mau Mau fighters as part of their interrogation of prisoners held without trial in the various concentration camps. The Mau Mau fighters are also known to have undertaken vicious massacres on villages, the most infamous of which was the Lari massacre of March 25, 1953, in which 97 men, women and children were herded into huts and burned alive, with those attempting to escape being either thrown back into the flames or hacked to death by machete. In the aftermath of the rebellion's defeat, Kenya was now set on an inevitable path to independence from colonial rule, this being in part due to the previous invulnerability of the British administration being challenged, as demonstrated by the Mau Mau, and the wave of brutal land clearances, imprisonments and torture conducted by the colonists that meant any trust in the British government's ability to rule with fairness and justice was irreparably damaged. There were also major financial impacts caused by the Mau Mau rebellion, with large amounts of money and resources being expended on the suppression of the militants during a period when the post-war UK economy was in a weakened state. In the end, Kenya was granted independence in December 1963, with former leader of the KAU, Jomo Kenyatta, becoming the first president of Kenya in 1964, immediately granting an amnesty to any remaining Mau Mau fighters in exchange for their surrender to the new government, though fighting continued into 1965, with those who refused to lay down their arms being branded outlaws by Kenyatta and were subsequently hunted down by the Kenyan army. Ultimately, the Mau Mau uprising demonstrated that, with the right leadership, a largely agrarian sector of the population could be organized into a formidable guerrilla fighting force against the sitting government, and through tactical proficiency would be able to destabilize the rule of the colonists and force them into a brutal response that led to the alienation of the local population. On the other hand, The Mau Mau Rebellion demonstrated perhaps one of the most successful anti-insurgency missions conducted by the British in the post-war era, as unlike the Cyprus Emergency and later Aden Emergency, the British could effectively defeat the rebels in both the city and the countryside, and thereby maintain continued control of the nation.